We have been told for decades that Soviet tanks were junk, crude, primitive, uncomfortable. Did you know that while American tankers sat on leather seats in their Shermans, legend says Soviet drivers kept the Sledgehammer next to them just to change gears? Yes, that sounds like a joke. But here is the thing we forget. That primitive tank is the only machine in history that made Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg, shake with fear. When the T-34 first appeared on the battlefield, the Germans didn't laugh. They froze. They asked each other in shock, how did they build this? German tanks were built like Swiss watches. But here is the brutal truth of the Eastern Front. A Swiss watch breaks in the mud. A sledgehammer just breaks the watch. We saw your comments. You asked, where is the bear? Why did you leave out the Russians? Let me be clear. There were no ideological reasons. We just saved the biggest beast for its own massive episode. You are absolutely right. You cannot tell the story of World War II without the T-34. So in this video, don't look for comfort. There are no human rights here. There is only cold steel, frozen oil, and 85 millimeters of death. Today, on the War Arsenal, we are unlocking the inventory of the Red Army. We will trace the bloody path from the tragedy of 1941 to the victory of 1945. We will see the tanks that were built by women and children in ruthless factories. We will see the monsters designed to hunt tigers. And we will separate the myths from the brutal reality. Don't bother buckling up because these tanks don't have seatbelts. Chapter 1: The Disaster, Light Tanks. To understand the ultimate victory, you have to understand the initial disaster. In June 1941, on paper, the Soviet Union had the largest tank force in the world. Around 20,000 tanks. That is more than the rest of the world combined. But numbers can be deceiving. Most of these machines were obsolete death traps. Let's start small. The tankettes. The T-27, based on the British Cardinoid design. We built over 2,000 of them. In our Italy video, we laughed at the L-3 tankette. Well, the Soviet T-27 was basically the same thing. A metal coffin on tracks, armed only with a machine gun. By 1941, they were totally useless against German panzers. They were mostly used to tow guns or were simply abandoned on the roadside because they broke down before reaching the front. Then, the backbone. The T-26. This was the most numerous tank in the Soviet arsenal when the war started. Over 10,000 were built. It was based on the British Vickers 6-ton. It had a 45mm gun, which was actually quite good for the time. It could penetrate early German tanks, but its armor was paper-thin, only 15mm. A heavy machine gun could punch right through it. In the Spanish Civil War, they did well, but against the coordinated German Blitzkrieg, they burnt. Thousands were lost in the first weeks of the war. Not just to enemy fire, but to poor maintenance and lack of fuel. And the speed demons, the BT series, BTT, BT5, BT7, Bystrokodny tank, fast tank. These were fascinating machines. They used the Christie suspension, the same American invention the British used in their cruiser tanks. The BT7 was a race car. It could hit, it could even take off its tracks and drive on road wheels like a car. The Soviet doctrine was aggressive. We will rush across the paved highways of Europe and attack the enemy in his own land. But as the Germans found out in our Germany video, Russia doesn't have highways. In the deep mud of the Ukraine, speed didn't matter. Armor did. And the BT-7 had none. When they were hit, their petrol engines often exploded instantly. We also have to mention the land battleships. The medium T-28. Look at this thing. It has 3 turrets. One big one with a 76mm gun and two small machine gun turrets in the front. It looks like something from a steampunk novel. In the 1930s, this was cutting edge. By 1941, it was a dinosaur. It was long, hard to hide, and the armor was too thin. But unlike the light tanks, its 76mm gun could actually hurt the Germans, and brave crews used them to cover the retreat. The Soviets were also obsessed with swimming. The T-37A, T-38, and T-40. Amphibious scouts. Great engineering achievements, but too fragile for total war. They were meant to scout across rivers, not fight. They were eventually replaced by the T-60. Now, the T-70 was important. It wasn't a good tank. It used ordinary truck engines welded together to make it move. It was rough, loud, and the commander was overworked. He had to find the enemy, load the gun, aim, and command the driver all at once. But it was cheap. It kept the Red Army fighting when the major tank factories were being evacuated east to the Urals. It held the line until the legend arrived. Chapter 2. The Legend. But all of those were just delays. The real shock, the weapon that changed the 20th century, arrived in late 1941. German General von Kleist famously said, "Their tanks were knocking at our door. But then, we met the T-34." The T-34-76, designed by Mikhail Kushkin. This man is a hero of the Soviet Union. To prove his design worked, he personally drove the prototype T-34 from Kharkov to Moscow in the dead of winter. He proved the tank was reliable, but he caught pneumonia from the freezing drive and died shortly after. He literally gave his life for this tank. Why was it so good? 3 reasons. Sloped armor. Before, the T-33 tanks were boxy, like the Tiger. The T-34 angled its armor at 60 degrees. A shell hitting it didn't hit a flat wall, it hit a slope and bounced off. 45mm of armor acted like 90mm effective thickness. Wide tracks. German tanks had narrow tracks that sank in the Russian mud. The T-34 had massive wide tracks. It floated over the terrain. 3. The V2 diesel engine. An aluminum V12 that was powerful and, unlike German petrol engines, didn't catch fire as easily. But let's go back to that Sledgehammer story. We need to be fair. In our USA video, we showed you the comfortable ergonomics of the Sherman. The T-34 interior was a dungeon. It had no turret basket. That means when the turret turned, the floor didn't turn with it. The loader had to walk around, dancing over boxes of ammo and spent shells, trying not to get his legs crushed by the machinery. And the transmission? Here is the truth about the myth. On the early models, 1940-1942, the 4-speed gearbox was a mechanical disaster. It was so stiff that drivers physically couldn't shift gears with just their hands. So yes, they often used a wooden mallet or their knee to bang the lever into place. It was exhausting. A driver would lose 5 pounds of sweat in a single battle. By 1943, they introduced a new 5-speed gearbox that fixed this, but the reputation of Soviet muscle remained. However, by 1943, the Germans adapted. The Tiger and Panther could kill the T-34 from long range. The 76mm gun was no longer enough. The Soviet answer wasn't a new tank. It was a bigger gun. The T-34-85, they put a massive 85mm anti-aircraft gun into a new, larger turret. Finally, they added a 5th crew member so the commander didn't have to aim the gun anymore. This was the tank that stormed Berlin. It wasn't the best tank on the battlefield. The German Panther was technically superior, but the T-34-85 was reliable, numerous, and deadly enough to win the war. We built over 50,000 T-34s in total. It was the AK-47 of tanks. Chapter 3. The Monsters. Heavy tanks. Stalin had a weakness for size. He loved land battleships. Before the war, they built the T-45. It had 5 turrets, and a crew of 11 people. It looked terrifying in Red Square parades. But in combat, it was a disaster. The commander couldn't control all 5 turrets. The armor was thin, and it was so long that it couldn't turn on a rough road without breaking its transmission. Most were abandoned without firing a shot. But from this failure came the KV series, Kliment Voroshilov, the KV-1. In 1941, the Germans had nothing that could penetrate this. There is a famous story from the Battle of Rassinier. A single KV-1 tank parked on a road and stopped an entire German panzer division for 24 hours. The Germans shot it with tanks, bounced off. They shot it with artillery, bounced off. They tried to sneak up and put mines on it, failed. Finally, they had to distract it with 50 tanks just to bring up an 88mm flak gun to kill it. The Germans called it the Russian Colossus, and the KV-2, the Death Fridge. Imagine a KV-1 chassis with a turret the size of a garden shed and a 52mm howitzer. This wasn't a tank, it was a mobile bunker buster. It fired a high-explosive shell so heavy, 40 kilograms, that if the tank was tilted on a hill, the turret motor wasn't strong enough to turn the gun. It was slow. It was top-heavy. But if that 52mm shell hit a German panzer, there was nothing left to repair. The tank didn't just explode. It was erased from existence. As the war progressed, the KV series evolved into the KV-85 and IS-1. But the ultimate evolution was the IS series IS of Stalin, the IS-2. We talked about the 70-ton mistake, King Tiger, in our Germany video. The IS-2 was the Soviet answer. It weighed only 46 tons, much lighter than the Tiger, but it carried a massive 120-tonner gun. This gun fired a shell the size of a log. It used 2-part ammunition. Projectile and charge were separate, so the reload speed was slow, maybe 2 rounds per minute. But it didn't matter. The kinetic energy of a 120-tonner shell was so massive that it didn't need to penetrate armor. If it hit a Panther tank, the impact force alone would crack the welds, shatter the transmission, or rip the turret straight off the hull. The IS-2 was the ultimate predator designed to hunt big cats. Chapter 4. The Beast Slayers. Sometimes, you don't need a turret. You just need a gun on tracks. The Soviets called them Samochodnaya Ustanovka. The most numerous was the Su-76 and Su-76M. It was built on the light T-70 chassis. It was open-topped. In the Russian winter, at -30 degrees, having no roof is torture. The crews called it the Suka, the bitch. It was cold, dangerous, and grenades could be thrown inside during city fights. But it was cheap, light, and served as the artillery support for the infantry all the way to Berlin. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the heavy hitters, Su-152 and ISU-152. Armed with the massive 152mm gun howitzer. When the Tiger tanks appeared, the Soviets didn't have a tank that could penetrate them yet, so they sent these. The troops gave it a new nickname, Zveroboy, the Beast Slayer. Why? Because it hunted tigers. It fired high-explosive rounds. When a 52mm HE shell hit a Tiger tank, it didn't pierce the armor like a needle. It smashed it like a hammer. The shockwave would kill the crew inside without even penetrating. Brutal, simple, effective. We also had the Su-85 and Su-100. These were dedicated tank destroyers built on the T-34 chassis. Low-profile, sloped armor. The Su-100 carried a Mundrad's naval gun that could kill almost anything. It was so robust that some are still used in conflicts in the Middle East today. And let's not forget the Su-22, A howitzer on a T-34? Excellent for blasting bunkers. Chapter 5. Desperation and Lend-Lease. The Soviet arsenal wasn't just tanks, it was pure desperation. In 1941, during the siege of Odessa, the defenders ran out of tanks. So factory workers took agricultural tractors, STZ-3, welded boiler plates onto them, and added fake guns or salvaged machine guns to make them look scary. They called it the NI tank, Naya Spug, literally for terror. It sounded like a tractor. It moved like a tractor. But at night they would attack with lights on and sirens wailing. The Romanian troops, thinking they were facing secret superweapons, fled in panic. It proves that you can fight with anything if you are determined enough. We also saw the return of armored trains. Russia is vast. The railways were the lifelines. Trains like the Tula armored train were essentially battleships on rails, covered in steel and artillery, patrolling the endless steppes. And finally, we have to talk about Lend-Lease. The Soviet Union didn't fight alone. The US and UK sent thousands of tanks. The Soviets hated the American M3 Lee. They called it a grave for 7 brothers, because it was a death trap. They tolerated the British Valentine, which we covered in our UK video, because it was reliable. But they actually respected the M4 Sherman, calling it MK. They loved that it didn't break down. They loved the leather seats. But they complained it was too tall and prone to tipping over on the icy Russian roads because of its high center of gravity. Still, elite Soviet Guards units rode American Shermans all the way to Vienna. So, looking back at the Soviet inventory, what do we see? We don't see the precision of Germany. We don't see the comfort of America. We see survival. The Soviet philosophy was cold math. If a German Tiger lasts 10 battles but costs 10 times as much, and a T-34 lasts 1 battle, but you can build 11 of them, the 11th T-34 wins the war. Stalin famously said, "Quantity has a quality all its own." But it wasn't just quantity. It was good enough engineering. The T-34 didn't need to last 10 years. It needed to last 6 months. The IS-2 didn't need to be precise. It needed to be devastating. The Red Steamroller wasn't elegant. It was rusty, it leaked oil. The crews froze in winter and boiled in summer. It was finished with a sledgehammer, but in the end, it was the Soviet T-34, not the German Tiger that sat parked in front of the ruins of the Reichstag. The sledgehammer had broken the watch. The Empire of the Sun. We have survived the frozen steppes of Russia. We have seen the factories of Detroit and the castles of Germany. But there is one major power left. An island nation with limited resources, but unlimited fanaticism. An army that believed surrender was a sin punishable by death. They didn't fight with heavy armor. They fought with their spirits. They turned their planes into missiles and their soldiers into human bombs. Next time we enter the jungles of the Pacific, we unlock the inventory of Imperial Japan, from the Zero fighter to the tanks that fought until the very last man. The Empire of the Sun is rising. You do not want to miss this. This is the War Arsenal. Subscribe, like, and check your 6.